The U.S. Navy has moved a carrier strike group to the waters off Venezuela. Is this preparation for an expansion of U.S. operations around Venezuela? And why is the president saying that land forces are next? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. But also, if you want to listen to us on Spotify in your car or in your headphones or just to drown out your kids screaming, you can do so now. Check the link in the description and be sure to give us a follow and a rating. That stuff really helps. Okay, so the U.S. has moved a carrier strike group towards Venezuela. And what I think is so interesting is that while people are speculating that there's this may be some attempt to overthrow the Venezuelan government, I actually think that that is probably not the case. And I'll explain why here in a second. But the U.S. has said that this is to bolster the capability of the United States to detect, monitor, and disrupt illicit actors and activities that compromise the safety and prosperity of the U.S. homeland and our security in the Western Hemisphere, from Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell, via social media, of course. And the fact is that an aircraft carrier is a massive leap up in firepower, certainly, especially firepower to take out one-off drug boats where there's really no military threat facing the U.S. Navy. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not still useful for things like a show of force. Now, here's the interesting analysis. It says the U.S. already has about 6,000 sailors and Marines in the region on board 8 warships, and now joined by the Gerald Ford and 5 destroyers in its strike group, along with 4,500 personnel. Now, remember that you're talking about around 10,000 personnel, but about half of those, or 3/4, are probably crew of the ships themselves, right? And so if this were to expand to a regime change type of operation, well, there's simply not the ground capability to do so. Bear in mind, for example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine that failed had about 100,000 troops on the ground involved. The U.S. invasion of Iraq had about 200,000. And the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, I think, was something in the 50 to 60,000 range. Now, the thing to take away from this, though, is that in the case of Afghanistan and Iraq, they were very different, right? And so the question is, what is the president's playbook, right? Is it going to look more like Iraq, more like Afghanistan, or remember, it could also look like Kosovo, right? Which was entirely a U.S. air campaign followed by U.S. peacekeepers, but only after the fighting had ceased. Now, the question is, what exactly is going on here? Because Trump has repeatedly raised the possibility of what he called, quote, land action in Venezuela, saying the U.S. is, quote, looking at land now after getting the sea very well under control. Trump adds, we stopped all drugs coming in by sea. I will stop all drugs from coming inland very shortly. You'll see that starting. Now, this is probably the best option. This is probably the best explanation of what he's trying to do, right? Because in the case, so you can, right, for example, in Kosovo, and the Balkan crises more generally in the 90s, the U.S. had entirely air power to try to eliminate what was seen at the time as an ongoing genocide. They used the term ethnic cleansing at the time because technically most countries had laws that if they called it a genocide, they had to actually intervene militarily to stop it. It's one of the ways that the international community doesn't recognize the Westphalian principle that inside a country, you kind of get to do what you want. So in Kosovo, they said, listen, there's some ethnic cleansing going on in the context of a civil war between Serbs and Croats and a bunch and Kosovars and Serbians and all of these ethnic tensions that had been stewing for a while, right? One side begins to dominate and begins to, well, basically commit an ethnic cleansing, right? Forcing the one ethnicity or one religious sect out of their homes and forcing them, right, either to flee or be killed. And so in response to this, the U.S. said, we are going to end the conflict with an air campaign. And what they did is they targeted the Serbian state and the Serbian dictator Slobodan Milosevic, who was using the state military to prosecute this genocide. And that was actually fairly effective. But the thing that happened there, it wasn't that there wasn't a ground war. There was, in fact, a smaller military and a government within Kosovo that was resisting, the KSA, I think it was called. And so the air power was the dominating force on the battlefield, but there was still troops on the ground who were still fighting, right? Who were still actively fighting. And the US was able to put its finger on the scale of an existing conflict. Now, this is also how the initial invasion of Afghanistan went. It was very small numbers of US forces in that initial push. But crucially, Afghanistan, about 25% of the territory of the country was held by the Northern Alliance, a sort of ragtag militia, but one that was organized and well equipped enough that the Taliban could never actually get complete control of the country. They had at most 75% of Afghanistan under control. So again, the U.S. was able to use its air assets to put its finger on the scale and take what had been a somewhat losing stalemate and tilt it in favor of the other side. But there was already an organized operational ground force working against that central government. Iraq needed hundreds of thousands of troops because that didn't exist. There was no Iraqi resistance movement. The closest you had was someone like the Kurds, but the Kurds had been fully demilitarized, fully stripped of power, and in a lot of cases, systematically persecuted by the Saddam regime. So in order to conduct an invasion, an actual regime change of a country where there is not already an organized resistance movement, an organized military that actually holds territory, that has the opposition government in some kind of stalemate, requires troops on the magnitude of hundreds of thousands, right? And if we look at the Iraq population in 2003, right, you know that it has around we'll say about 25 million people, right? And the Venezuela population in 2024 is about that size. So again, you can see that a large number of Venezuelans have fled the country since about 2017. And so it's fair to say that the ballpark number that you should see to conduct a true ground invasion is going to be in the 200,000 range. So the U.S. would have to essentially something like 50x the number of troops. And there's a real logistics problem here, right? Because you might recall that in the invasion of Iraq, there was a multi-pronged operation that involved, right, U.S. forces staging in U.S. ally Saudi Arabia's territory. You had actually U.S. forces in Turkey and even a small airborne contingent operating in Iraq. But you could see that it relied on having allies in the area that allowed us to pre-stage their troops. There's a huge problem here. Venezuela does not offer that, right? Colombia, well, the president just called Trump just called the president of Colombia a narco-terrorist. So they're probably not in a hurry to hold U.S. troops. You have Brazil, who Trump explicitly said at the UN meeting that he hates President Lula, who's seen as a leftist who actually arrested and jailed the corrupt would-be military dictator Bolsonaro, who Trump really loved. And then you have countries like Guyana, who definitely have a problem with Venezuela, but aren't exactly clamoring to host U.S. forces. So meaning that essentially the United States really doesn't have that many options to even stage 200,000 troops to try to take Venezuela. And if they did, there's a bunch of issues, namely that the U.S. really can conduct its big invasion operations in open terrain. And boy, there is not much open terrain here. It's a jungle out there, literally. So sure, they could probably get into Caracas, right, and potentially try to take some of the key coastal territories, but that just doesn't seem realistic or even that helpful, given that, again, if their goal is to eliminate drug trafficking, and it's worth noting, we did some analysis here on this channel, and we also looked at the DEA's 2024 report on the state of international drug trafficking, and overwhelmingly, the originators, the number one problem child is, of course, fentanyl produced in China, shipped over, and packaged by Mexican drug cartels. So, again, what we're looking at is just a real dichotomy here, right? Where Venezuela is just not the source of the problem, right? They're not even a top 10 source of the problem. And yet they're being treated with the full weight of the U.S. military. It's very bizarre. Again, my only thesis is that Trump is just trying to kill people to get attention because he relies on a constant like burnout level of controversy. So like tearing down the White House, killing a bunch of random people on boats that they say are terrorists. And the weird part is, again, Trump has said he doesn't really see the need to go to Congress to target these individuals, even though it's legally required. This is one of the big problems here. My problem is not should the U.S. launch strikes against Venezuela or against narco traffickers. I mean, I have a problem with the method of just bombing boats, and especially when the president himself is out there joking, saying, I wouldn't go fishing in those waters, which implies that he thinks there's a medium chance that they were fishing boats. But Trump has said he doesn't feel the need to go to Congress over war with drug cartels. He said they're going to be like dead, right? Donald Trump has no plans to ask Congress for a declaration of war against drug cartels after his administration killed 37 people in missile strikes, right? When asked why he won't seek a resolution from Congress for this campaign, he said the government is just going to kill people instead. I don't think we're necessarily going to ask for a declaration of war. I just think we're going to kill people that are bringing drugs to our country, okay? We're going to kill them. They're going to be like dead, okay? He continued. I mean, the Constitution, right? It says that the declaration of war, well, Article 1 lays out that Congress has the sole power to formally declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures. The president can use military power in response to an attack, but a formal declaration is a separate congressional power. Now, formal declarations of war are rare, but Congress produces something else, which is the same thing, which is the AEUMF, right? And the AUMF is like a declaration of war is whatever you say it is. And if you want to call it, you don't want to call it declaration of war, you call it authorization for use of military force. It's the same thing. It fulfills the same legal requirement, right? And the U.S. also has this thing called the War Powers Resolution, which meant that the president could engage in some level of military operations on a small scale and on a small timeline, but the president was required to go to Congress after a certain period has elapsed. And so the issue is that the authorization for use of military force gave the U.S. gave the commander-in-chief a blank check, essentially, to use force wherever he thought there would be terrorists who contributed to like the 9/11 attacks. And that meant, in George Bush's interpretation, the right to go after all Islamic extremist terror groups, Al-Qaeda, but it also encompassed his authorization to go after Saddam Hussein, who was not really funding Islamic terror groups. Now, you can see that what this doesn't authorize, the AUMF, it doesn't authorize Trump to target Venezuelan drug gangs. And if he's not going to ask for it, then what you have, again, as he says, I'm just going to kill people. So he's just admitting that this isn't a war. I'm using the military to just kill people, which is insane. Like, I can't, do you think this is a good way to do military operations? And I get it. You're like, well, the U.S. did like kind of a version of this, right? They used drone strikes in Yemen. They would have drone strikes into Pakistan. But all of that was covered under the authorization for use of military force. The problem is that the Supreme Court has said the only entity that can sanction the president for exercising president stuff, like being the commander-in-chief, is Congress. And so, in effect, this is the final step. We've replaced the declaration of war with these broad authorization for use of military force. And now we're finally just doing away with it. We're saying, well, if Congress has a problem with it, they could take it up with me. They could say something. And because they're not, they must be okay with it, which is not the same thing, right? I don't know what else to tell you. Like, there's nothing about this that is okay. Again, you can sit there and go, well, this Trump is just the final form of what has already been a pretty problematic relationship between the U.S. and Congress and the use of military force and its expansion, right? This broadly written AUMF that never really expired. That is already problematic. Essentially granting a war forever against anyone. But now it's being just taken to its final form, right? People say, well, the Constitution was just sort of playing around when it said Congress had to authorize the war. But it's not. The Constitution still really matters. And Congress still has to authorize this kind of operation. And the fact that the president is just going out there and saying, no, I'm not going to ask Congress. I don't care what the Constitution says. I'm just going to kill people because I want to. Should be kind of scary to all of us. Anyway, guys, thanks to Colonel tier members. Guys like Alfred Chesky, Alan Knutson, Christine Schumann, Dan M., Deborah Oppenheimer, all of our Lieutenant tier members. You guys really help me out. I appreciate you. And I will see all you guys in the next one. Cheers.